morning, everyone. This hearing will come to order. Thank you for joining us today to discuss legislation pending before the subcommittee. The 6 bills on today's agenda address issues that are very important to veterans and their families. These bills would extend eligibility for memorial headstones and markers to family members whose remains are tragically not available for burial or cremation. Extend benefits to families of veterans who are buried in tribal cemeteries. Help protect vulnerable veterans from financial fraud. Require VA to improve the notices they send to veterans who may have received an overpayment. Remind us of the important contributions made by various cities to the World War efforts during World War II, and determine whether Congress should designate a museum in Columbus, Ohio as a National Veterans Memorial and Museum. We have a full agenda today, so in the interest of time, I'm going to keep everyone, including myself, to no more than the five minutes that we have set aside. I appreciate that the bill sponsors have worked hard on these proposals, and I'm looking forward to the discussions, how these bills will impact veterans and their families. Now I'm going to turn it over to Distinguished Ranking Member Ms. Esty for her opening statements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor to serve as the ranking member of the Disability Assistance and Memorial Affairs Committee. And as a subcommittee, we've already made significant progress towards improving the disability benefit system for all of our veterans. And I'm proud of our efforts to work in a very bipartisan manner to create substantive legislation that affects the lives of veterans and their families across America. But we still have more work to do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your willingness to work across the aisle to listen to all members of the subcommittee, Democrats and Republicans, and for hosting today's hearing with a number of our distinguished colleagues who have excellent proposals that we are eager to work with you in bringing forward in a way that can pass both the House, the Senate, and get signed by the President.
Thank you, Ms. Esty. I'm honored to be joined this morning by several of our colleagues who are going to be testifying about the bills they have sponsored. Representative Jim Banks of Indiana, Representative Bruce Poliquin of Maine, Representative David Rozier of North Carolina, Representative Steve Stivers of Ohio, Representative Joyce Beatty of Ohio, Representative Matt Cartwright of Pennsylvania, and Representative Shelley Pingree of Maine. Welcome to all of you. I appreciate all of you taking the time out of your day to be here with us for sponsoring legislation that will help our nation's veterans. We'll begin on our committee colleagues that are here, and we will be speaking, they'll be speaking from the dais. Mr. Banks, you're recognized for 5 minutes to discuss H.R. 3656.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Because of our veterans' service on behalf of each and every one of us, it's our responsibility to do our best in this Congress to serve them. And this commitment doesn't stop simply at their pay during their service, but we assist them in medical recovery and succeeding in the civilian world, and just as importantly, in memorializing the life that they lived once they've passed. Current law provides memorial headstones for veterans and for their spouses and children when their remains cannot be found. And those unfortunate circumstances sometimes occur in such cases as boating accidents or plane accidents. Public Law number 105-368 provides for spouses and was enacted in 1998. Public Law 109-461 provides for dependent children and was enacted in 2006. Both groups were eligible for the benefit as of the date of enactment. It was overlooked, though, that the latter date was not planned to be made consistent with the first. My bill, H.R. 3656, amends Title 38 of the United States Code to provide for a consistent eligibility date for spouses and dependent children. The date for both will be set at the current date for spouses, November 11, 1998. This is especially necessary for the unfortunate cases when a spouse and dependent child have passed away in the same accident during a period in which the child was ineligible for a headstone while the spouse was not. The father and/or mother was then able to be memorialized, yet not the child who was with them in this tragic incident. This is a practical and simple fix to take care of our veteran community and to keep our commitment with them. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. With that, we'd like to go to Representative Rouser, let's begin with you, and you are recognized to discuss your bill, H.R. 1721.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify before you on H.R. 1721, a bill that would recognize one city each year as a World War II city for the work and contributions their citizens made to the United States war effort, as well as to recognize all their work to continue to preserve that history. There are great and noble citizens in Wilmington, North Carolina, who have worked hard to bring recognition to these many unspoken heroes. In cities all around the country, in fact, great Americans labored long, tireless hours in factories, shipyards, and in the fields, working to ensure that our service members were well fed and well equipped. Without the efforts of our industrial centers and cities, we would have never been able to win that brutal war. At present, there is no national recognition for cities or towns that made outstanding contributions to that war effort, or for those cities that made significant efforts to preserve that history. The primary purpose of this bill is to change that. Just as we must not forget those who gave all to defend the freedoms of the rest of us, we must not forget those who did whatever they could to see the needs of our military, that the needs of our military were met. Let me take this opportunity to thank the committee for recognizing this fact and including this bill language in H.R. 677, the American Heroes COLA Act of 2015, which passed the House in the 114th Congress. And I certainly appreciate the committee's consideration of this bill again. Mr. Chairman, I have a timeline dating from 1946 to present that details the work done by many fine citizens in Wilmington to preserve the history of the city's efforts during World War II, and I ask that it be inserted in the record. And I appreciate, again, the opportunity to come before the committee and testify today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rouser. And prior to a previous agreement, Mr. Stivers, who introducing House H.R. 1900, will share his time with Ms. Beatty, who is the lead co-sponsor. So, Mr. Stivers, you're recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Chairman Boston, Ranking Member Esty for moving this important hearing forward. Our bill will designate the National Veterans Memorial and Museum being built in Columbus, Ohio, as the National Veterans Memorial and Museum. This center will serve as a civic landmark to honor, connect, and inspire and educate all Americans about the service and sacrifice of more than 22 million veterans in this country. And I know you're asking yourself, why are we going to do this in Columbus, Ohio? There's a lot of reasons why. First of all, Ohio is the home of the 6th largest veteran population in the United States. It's also within an 8-hour car ride of more than half the population of the United States. There are lots of other reasons why I think it makes sense, we will continue to move those forward. I want you to know that this center is fully funded for the construction. It was raised with private dollars. We've worked with our veteran service organizations. You'll hear from some of them on a later panel, and most are supportive. I am open to putting in the bill some language that would require VSOs to have positions on the board. That's already the plan, and if that needs to be a condition of making sure that we actually get a designation, I'm fully supportive of that. I do want to thank Colonel Tom Moe, who is from Ohio and was a great member of our armed forces, retired from the United States Air Force after 85 flying missions, was captured in Vietnam and held in North Vietnam from 1968 through 1973. He's been very active in a lot of issues and is very involved in the building of this very important museum and memorial. I second want to thank Joyce Beatty, my lead Democrat sponsor of the bill. I've been told this is one of the few times when you've had bipartisan support for a bill like this on the testimony. I appreciate you making it available, and I yield the balance of my time to the Congresswoman.
Ms. Beatty, you're recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to Ranking Member Esty. Thank you for holding this hearing today and letting us come in this bipartisan manner. And I want to echo everything that Congressman Stivers had said. I am very honored to be here and ask you for your consideration, because not only would this bill designate the Veterans Memorial and Museum being built, I must add, in my 3rd Congressional District in Ohio as a National Veterans Memorial and Museum, it would also honor countless veterans who have answered the call to serve, veterans like my father, who would be so honored to know that I'm doing this with Congressman Stivers today. I also want to thank the American Legion, the Paralyzed Veterans of America, the VFW, who are testifying in support of H.R. 1900 and the designation. I join Mr. Stivers not only in mentioning and talking about all the great work that the Colonel Tom Moe has done, but also with us, I want to recognize Guy Worley and Amy Taylor, who are the project managers for the museum, and they are here from Columbus. You've heard some of the statistics and data. Why Ohio? Because nearly 1 million veterans live in Ohio. You've heard about the 8-hour drive to nearly 1/2 of the United States population, not to mention the 7.5 million veterans who also live within that 8-hour drive of Ohio, which is just a little less than 40% of the entire veterans population. It makes it a perfect destination for school trips, for family vacations, for veterans and the families and survivors. This was in part the brainchild of someone we all know who served so well in World War II, the legendary astronaut, former U.S. Senator from Ohio, John Glenn, a dear friend of mine and who was also a constituent. If he were here today, he would highlight this museum and its memorial. He would talk about the 300-foot reflective pool. He would talk about the memorial wall. He would talk about the sanctuary where veterans' families and others could go. So it's a tremendous idea, and certainly we ask for your support.
Thank you. Because I tell you what we'd like to do now is we will want to hear from Ms. Pingree of Maine to talk about H.R. 3705, which was noticed for the hearing of this hearing as a draft bill. And so you recognize, thank you for being here.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman. And thank you also to Ranking Member Esty and to everyone on the committee. Thank you for the work that you all do and for hearing this bill today. I believe my bill offers a common sense fix to frustrations that some veterans in my district have shared with me, which I know veterans across the country have also experienced. My district office has been contacted by veterans who frankly are shocked and surprised to learn that they owe money to the VA for overpayment of benefits or some other reason, sometimes months or even years after the debts were incurred. By the time they inquire, they are told by the VA, hey, tough luck, the clock ran out. You've lost the ability to dispute, seek forgiveness, or create a payment plan for your alleged debt. We've seen single mom veterans who can't get a home loan, newly transitioned service members who struggle to reintegrate with garnished pay, recoup tax returns, and reduce disability payments, all because of assigned debts they knew nothing about because something, quote, got lost in the mail. Current VA regulations provide that such debtors are notified by ordinary mail, which is deemed to provide a sufficient notification to a veteran of an outstanding debt and what his or her rights of redress are. The problem is that people move. Mail can get lost. This is a particular challenge for homeless vets or those without fixed addresses. At times, the error is on the VA side. Our caseworkers have uncovered instances where the VA sent mailings to addresses in states where the veteran has never lived. H.R. 3705, the Veterans Fair Debt Notice Act, proposes a very straightforward solution. It requires the VA to modify its regulations so that debt notifications are sent by certified mail. Thus, the VA would know that the veteran has actually received the letter. Likewise, it directs the VA to request that veterans seeking waivers use certified mail so a veteran knows that the VA has received his or her response. We've heard from veterans who have submitted waivers tried to create a payment plan, or tried to dispute the charges within the allotted time period, only to be told by the VA that the office never received their materials. Lastly, my bill requires the VA to use plain language in how it communicates to a veteran about his or her debts and the rights to challenge it or seek accommodations. In my opinion, a veteran should not have to rely on a congressional caseworker to interpret the VA's bureaucratic ease. I think all of us know from our district offices, we often confront things that we think, well, we are very happy to help, our office can do it for you, but you shouldn't need a member of Congress to solve your problem. I urge the committee to approve the Veterans Fair Debt Notice Act to promote accountability, consumer protection, efficiencies in the VA system, and fairness to our veterans who deserve peace of mind. Finally, I appreciate the support of this legislation from veteran service organizations who can attest to the frustrations that their members have experienced. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Pingree. We are waiting still on Mr. Cartwright. Let me do this right quick for the betterment of our members who are here. We normally forego any questions for our colleagues, and any questions may be submitted in writing for the record. But we do want to thank you for being here today, and I don't expect you to stand around and wait for the other members to come in. But I believe we will. Any questions can be submitted in writing, and I believe we will do so. Members will need to have a quick turnaround on those questions. There are some questions that we were specifically wanting to ask up here, but we are going to forego that, and if you receive those questions, if your staff could get back to us as quick as possible, I appreciate that. So thank you so much. We are still waiting. We are going to recess for just a moment while waiting on a member, but if you'll just stay in your seats, it will be just a moment. We think he's coming down the hall. Yeah, got it. Okay. Okay, we're going to come back to order, and I invite the second panel to the table, if you would. Thank you for being here. Joining us today is Mr. Matthew Sullivan, who is the Deputy Undersecretary for Finance and Planning and CFO of the National Cemetery Administration. Mr. Sullivan is accompanied by Ms. Roberta Lowe, the Director of Office and Inter-Controls, and Acting Director of the Department Management Center of the Office of Management, and Cheryl Rawls, who is the Director of Pensions and Fiduciary Services of the Veterans Benefits Administration. We are also joined by Ms. Elizabeth Curta, who is the Director of Education and Security Team for GAO. Thank you all for being here. Mr. Sullivan, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Esty, and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to provide the views of the Department of Veterans Affairs on pending legislation affecting VA's programs. My written testimony provides more details on VA's views for the 6 bills on the agenda today. However, I will provide a few brief comments on them as well. First, VA recognizes the merits of both H.R. 1721, regarding the designation of American World War II cities, and H.R. 1900, the National Veterans Memorial and Museum Act. VA appreciates the intent behind these bills, but notes that each is programmatically outside VA's core mission. In addition, H.R. 1721 would potentially divert VA resources that are designated for veterans and their dependents. H.R. 3122, the Veterans Care Financial Protection Act of 2017, would require VA to work with federal agencies, states, and other appropriate experts to develop and implement federal and state standards for protecting pension claimants and beneficiaries from dishonest, predatory, or otherwise unlawful practices. VA agrees with the intent of the bill and welcomes the opportunity to share information about common predatory practices involving VA benefits, particularly VA pension, with key financial regulators and stakeholders to help them identify and enforce existing standards and develop additional standards where appropriate. However, VA suggests that the bill clarify the appropriate role of the collaborating entities, especially those with authority to enforce existing laws designed to protect veterans and elderly claimants. Both H.R. 3656 and H.R. 3657 are similar to proposals in the President's budget for fiscal year 2018, and VA supports them with minor modification. H.R. 3656 would establish a consistent applicability date for the provision of memorial headstones and markers for spouses, surviving spouses, and dependent children. A consistent applicability date would allow VA to provide a memorial headstone or marker, commonly referred to as the in memory of marker, or IMO, in a manner that creates less confusion and concern for claimants, as well as streamline the administrative process for VA. However, VA does recommend a simple modification to the language of the amendment to make clear that the proposed effective date of November 11, 1998 applies to the death of the spouse, surviving spouse, or dependent child of a veteran, and not the death of the veteran, him or herself. We would be happy to work with the subcommittee to provide suggested language for this modification. H.R. 3657 would ensure that eligible spouses and dependent children interred in tribal veteran cemeteries have access to the same benefits as those in state veteran cemeteries. Since 1980, VA has been authorized to provide burial headstones and markers to eligible spouses and dependent children of veterans interred in veteran cemeteries owned by states, but not those owned by tribal organizations. This bill would eliminate that discrepancy. However, VA urges the subcommittee to consider expanding the applicability of H.R. 3657 to include memorial headstones and markers under Section 2306, Part B as well. This would ensure that VA can provide the same memorialization benefits in a tribal veteran cemetery as are available in a state veteran cemetery. Again, we would be happy to work with the subcommittee to provide this language. Finally, H.R. 3705, the draft bill entitled Veterans Fair Debt Notice Act of 2017, would require VA veterans and others to use certified mail for correspondence regarding debts owed to VA or request to waive such indebtedness. The bill would require that VA use plain language in all communications with the debtor and to explain the options available to the debtor. While VA generally supports the use of plain language and providing clear explanations to the debtor, we do not support the requirement to use certified mail in communication between veterans and the department. This change would increase the burden on veterans who may currently submit waiver requests via regular United States mail, commercial carrier, facsimile, and electronic mail, as well as through the various VBA regional offices located throughout the nation. Veterans would incur additional costs for submitting waiver requests and risk meeting associated deadlines. Additionally, using certified mail would increase costs to the department, taking away funds from the very programs established to assist veterans. This concludes my testimony. Thank you for the opportunity to present our views on these bills, and we look forward to working with the subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Ms. Carter, you please begin your testimony on behalf of the GAO, if you would.
Chairman Bost, Ranking Member Esty, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on certain provisions of H.R. 3122, the Veterans Care and Financial Protection Act. This bill seeks to address the financial exploitation of veterans who are eligible for a higher pension because they need regular assistance to perform everyday living activities. Individuals receiving the enhanced benefit for aid and attendance could be vulnerable to dishonest, predatory, or otherwise unlawful practices, which the proposed legislation aims to address. Today, I will first discuss our prior work related to potential threats to VA pension applicants, and will then provide observations on certain provisions of the Veterans Care Financial Protection Act. In our prior work, we have identified potential threats to the financial security of veterans who applied for pension benefits. For instance, in 2012, we identified entities such as financial planners that marketed its services to veterans seeking to qualify for pension benefits by offering veterans products and services that could adversely affect them. In 2013, we also reported on shortcomings in VA's process for ensuring that representatives approved to assist veterans with the claims process were adequately knowledgeable and have good moral character as required by law. GAO made recommendations to VA to address these and other shortcomings, and VA has taken steps to implement our recommendations. For example, VA will increase training requirements for representatives approved to assist veterans with their pension benefit claims. However, additional opportunities exist to examine these issues. For example, our prior work on issues relating to gaining access to VA pension benefits for veterans is now 4 to 5 years old and could be updated. In addition, we have not examined the potential vulnerabilities of veterans who are already receiving aid and attendance benefits. Now, I would like to discuss 3 provisions of the Veterans Care Financial Protection Act of 2017. The first provision is the proposed requirement for VA to develop and submit standards to the Senate and House committees on Veterans Affairs within 180 days of enactment. Protecting veterans from financial exploitation is vital, and developing a set of standards could help VA combat such practices. However, this proposed legislation does not clearly specify whether the standards to protect veterans are intended to be legally binding. Providing this clarification is important for determining what steps VA would need to take to develop the standards and whether completing these steps within 180 days is feasible. Establishing legally binding regulations requires following procedures such as requiring agencies to publish a notice of proposed rulemaking in the Federal Register, soliciting and reviewing comments, and other time-consuming steps. In contrast, if Congress does not intend the standards to be legally binding, agencies may issue guidance to help interpret regulations or share good practices. The second provision is the proposed requirement to have GAO report on standards that we determine would be effective in protecting veterans should VA not meet the 180-day deadline. We follow generally accepted government auditing standards, which require us to maintain independence and identify and mitigate threats to our independence for our audits. For example, one such threat to independence that our standards identify is the self-review threat, which results from auditors reviewing a service or work that they previously provided to an agency. In this case, if GAO were to set standards for this program and VA were to adopt them, it would be inappropriate for GAO to then audit implementation of standards that GAO had recommended. In addition, it would be inappropriate for GAO to set standards for VA because setting standards for an executive branch program is an executive branch function. Thus, we recommend removing the proposed provision requiring GAO to submit a report containing standards. Finally, I would like to point out that the proposed requirement for GAO to complete a study on the standards implemented under the proposed legislation is, by itself, and if GAO does not set the standards, an appropriate role for GAO. In conclusion, enhanced pension benefits provide a critical support to veterans with disabilities, many of whom are elderly and have limited financial resources to care for themselves. Individuals who seek to exploit these veterans can cause real financial harm. Our continued ability to conduct audits in this area by maintaining our independence and mitigating threats to that independence will help Congress, VA, and the public oversee this important program. This concludes my prepared statement, and I'm happy to answer the committee's questions.
Thank you, and we're going to go to questions in a moment, but first off, I'd like first off to ask unanimous consent of the committee that Mr. Cartwright is allowed to give his testimony from the dais with no one objecting. Next, I want Mr. Cartwright of Pennsylvania to talk about House Resolution, H.R. 3122. Mr. Cartwright, you can begin at any moment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
5 minutes.
And Ranking Member Esty, nice to be here today. I'd like to thank you for holding this hearing and giving me an opportunity to speak about an important issue affecting our veterans that that ought to concern all of us here in Congress. As Americans, we can all agree we've made a moral covenant with the men and women that served in our armed forces, and if you risk your safety for the sake of protecting the ideals this great country was founded upon, we will take care of you. And the gravity of that covenant cannot be understated. It is a core responsibility that we owe our veterans. As part of this enduring commitment to those who have served this nation, the VA provides what is called an aid and attendance benefit to the growing number of low-income veterans who are in need of our support. This benefit helps pay for assisted living and in-home personal care for veterans who qualify for a VA pension and are housebound or require the aid and attendance of another person. Unfortunately, and regrettably, a number of unscrupulous actors are increasingly exploiting this assistance program by preying on our older veterans' vulnerability. By abusing the VA bureaucracy, these criminals are wasting federal dollars and turning this well-deserved benefit into a financial nightmare for those who can least afford it. A recurrent scam involves charging veterans a non-existent application fee to obtain the benefit. Consultation fees and fake promises to expedite the application process for a cost are also common. Yet another scam involves an offer to, quote-unquote, help veterans qualify for the benefit, even when their net worth is too high to qualify. These so-called helpful individuals then take control of the veteran's assets and move them into an irrevocable trust or an annuity, which the elderly veteran often cannot access for many years. This kind of financial transfer can also delay or disqualify the veteran for other assistance like Medicaid. Some retirement homes recruit residents with promises that the veterans will receive this A&A benefit, which would cover the cost of the home. If the A&A claim is later denied, however, the nursing home then demands back payment from the veteran. This is a practice that leaves vulnerable elderly veterans with the undesirable choice of draining their own remaining assets or giving up their new home. The Veterans Care Financial Protection Act seeks to address this travesty by directing federal agencies to work with the states and outside experts to establish standards that will put an end to this kind of financial fraud. Specifically, the bill aims to develop and implement state and federal standards that protect veterans from dishonest, predatory, or otherwise unlawful practices relating to the A&A benefit. It would also direct the GAO to study the implementation and effectiveness of those standards 18 months after their creation. By using the 2006 Military Personnel Financial Services Protection Act as a model, this bipartisan common sense proposal would prevent waste and protect veterans without spending new money or imposing any mandates. Now, we owe this to our veterans, and this makes sense. In speaking with the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, prior to this hearing, I do understand that there may be further changes necessary to the text of the bill before it reaches its final version. However, my staff and I remain committed to working with the GAO. We'll make ourselves available to it and the committee to ensure the success of this important piece of legislation and look forward to further discussions. As such, I thank them for their attention to this critical issue. I'd also like to thank Senator Warren for her hard work on this bill in the Senate. And lastly, thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing and giving me the opportunity to speak about this, the Veterans Care Financial Protection Act. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cartwright, and thank you for being here. We have explained to the other members, we forego any questions of our colleagues at this time. if we have any questions, we will submit them for the record, and then if they're directed to you, we'd like for you to get back to us as quick as you can with those. Thank you. Now we want to go back to the panel with questions we do have, and I will now yield myself 5 minutes to start the questions off. Ms. Rawls, is the VA able to effectively develop and implement federal and state standards to protect veterans and their survivors who receive aid and attendance benefits?
Thank you for that question, Chairman. I will tell you that the VA does have some concerns in being able to put into place standards that we can thus enforce for those entities out there that are currently preying upon veterans. We also know that by working with others that are in the community as well as the state and federal agencies, that this problem is also out there for others that are outside the veteran population.
Ms. Curtin, the next question I have for you is you stated that there are other ways a GAO would provide support for fraud prevention at the VA, other than submission of a report to Congress. Can you kind of elaborate on where you think that we should go with that?
Certainly, we could do work in a number of areas, either at your request or in the legislation that could shed light on these issues and help to identify solutions and help VA, perhaps in its role in setting standards. The issues we could look at, as I alluded to in my statement, the work we did in this area on claiming benefits is becoming old, and we could take a fresh look at the kinds of issues that claimants are experiencing with financial exploitation. We could take a fresh look at VA's process for vetting and training representatives who are approved to assist veterans, and we could certainly take a look at industry practices in terms of marketing financial services to veterans. We could also do a sort of a survey or a look at the standards that exist out there generally for to prevent the financial exploitation of the elderly that exist in federal and state agencies, and provide a report that would sort of describe the sort of different relevant types of standards that could inform VA's efforts. These are just a few examples, but we are happy to work with the committee on, technical amendments to the bill that could address this concern.
Thank you. I have to believe that everybody at the table, along with everybody here, believes we should cure the problem. The question is which agency handles it, and how do we handle it most effectively? It is a real problem that is occurring. Mr. Sullivan, the VA recommended that Congress amend H.R. 3657 regarding expanding eligibility for markers and headstones within the tribal cemeteries. Can you kind of explain why it is and how it was they were left out, and where you want to go with that? Where do you think we should go with that?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. Back in 1980, we received the authority to provide burial headstones and markers for spouses and dependents in state veteran cemeteries. We only received the authority to actually provide grants for establishment of tribal veteran cemeteries in 2006. So the legislation really has not caught up to provide this benefit for spouses and dependents in tribal veteran cemeteries.
Thank you. Ms. Lowe, could you please explain why the VA doesn't use certified mail to ensure veterans receive notice of an alleged overpayment?
Thank you for that question. We do not use certified mail because the legislation requires that we use basically first-class postage. If we use certified mail, a veteran, if they were not home when we attempted to deliver certified mail, would have to take possibly time off from work to go to the post office to sign for the document, or they may ignore the notice completely, and then the document would be returned, the letter would be returned to us anyhow.
Okay, then to follow up on that, if the veteran does not respond to a notice that's sent normal mail, how does the VA inform the veteran of the alleged overpayment?
We sent out at the Debt Management Center 2.5 million documents to veterans last year, and of those, approximately 10% or 250,000 were returned to us for incorrect addresses. We use the address correction provided by the U.S. Postal Service for about 130,000 of those, and the other 120,000, we work with a company called LexisNexis to obtain updated mailing addresses. If we're unsuccessful in that venue, when the debt is transferred according to debt collection laws to the U.S. Treasury, they have access to IRS records and Social Security records, and they can find additional addresses that way.
Thank you. With that, my time has expired. Ms. Esty, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of you for joining us here today and share several of the Chairman's questions. But I'd like to follow up with you, Ms. Lowe, further on this issue about the debt collection, because I've experienced this with veterans in my district, and I think we have to do better. It is manifestly unfair for people who don't get these. So one of the questions is veterans, and I've encountered this with veterans, have updated their address, say with VBA, and it doesn't get reported back over. So in fact, part of the system is aware of the updated address and another part is not. Can you discuss what do you think could be done to better connect those two? Because again, I think we can all agree, veterans want to do right by this, but if they've received an overpayment and they don't know about it because it's an old address, it leaves a really, really difficult situation for them, and then our offices end up getting involved, and that's not good for anybody.
Making it easier for veterans to update their addresses would be one way. The other thing is moving into more of a digital era where veterans have the option to opt in. We service multiple generations, some of which only depend on the U.S. Postal Service, and some of which only depend on electronic mail. For example, my son, I have to call him and ask him to go check his mailbox if I've sent him something. So we need to give veterans the option to be able to opt into electronic mail, and that way we could send notices to them in that manner. We would also need your help to change the legislation to allow the delivery of electronic mail, because right now the legislation requires it to be sent by the U.S. Post Office.
Well, I think we'd be very interested in exploring ways to effectively get notice. We have an expression in my office, effective service, a process. You have not done your job to send a letter out. We need to know the veteran received it and that they understand it. I'm glad to hear the commitment from all of you about making sure that we have plain language. I think that's incredibly important, and that needs to be an initiative across the entire agency, because we owe it to them to be able to open a letter and understand it. They shouldn't have to call their VSO, and they certainly shouldn't have to call one of us to understand what they just received in the mail. We'd be very happy to work with you on electronic as an option. But I do think, speaking for myself, I think we need to know, I think first-class mail is insufficient notice for something like recouping a debt. And I think we need to, in addition to providing electronic opt-in, I believe it is appropriate. Now, in the testimony, there's an indication that that can't be done somehow because there's a queue, and the queue has a whole lot of letters going out, and they'd have to be sorted. Some would qualify for this certified process, and some would be inappropriate. Is there some reason that they couldn't just be run as two separate lists? I mean, there are Excel spreadsheets. You code them and you run the set that need to be done by certified, and they run in a different way. Is there any reason we couldn't do that?
I don't have that information, but we'll be sure and take that for the record.
All right, thank you. I appreciate that. Let me look through my list of other things we have not. Actually, for the VA, a little bit about, you said it's outside the core mission for talking about for the designation of, for example, World War II city. Do you think there's another agency other than the VA that would be appropriate to oversee that? Would that be the Smithsonian or something, to talk about home side, home front support for the war? We're very supportive of those efforts. Understand that the Secretary and the agency may have others. Do you have suggestions about an appropriate alternative agency to accomplish the same purpose?
Ranking Member Esty, thank you for the question. I don't have a specific organization in mind right now, but I do believe that there is a federal agency that would be more aligned, their mission be more aligned to evaluating a civilian population's home front efforts during wartime, and evaluating how well that city has preserved the history of that city's efforts during wartime. I just don't think it's the best suited for VA to do that.
Thank you very much. I know I have some questions, which will probably be in part for the VSOs, on the National Veterans Museum about whether there have been others in the past that have been started independently by nonprofits. One of the questions that we may need help with is understanding what kind of endowment is typically necessary when the Smithsonian usually gets involved for curation issues, and so that we ensure that something that receives a designation as national indeed reflects the entire country, and that we're stewards of the taxpayer dollars. So we may be following up with some further questions for you on follow-up to those. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Estes. And also know that the panel, we may have staff reach out with further questions and ask you to give those back in writing so that we can kind of work forward with these issues. But thank you for being here. This panel is excused, and if the third panel will move forward, that would be wonderful. Okay, joining on us on our third panel is Mr. Alec Zhang, Assistant Director of the National Veterans Affairs and Rehabilitation Division of the American Legion, Mr. Leroy Acosta, the Assistant National Legislative Director of Disabled American Veterans, Mr. Blake C. Ortner, who is the Deputy Governor Relations Director for the Paralyzed Veterans of America, Ms. Kathleen Mockler, the Director of Survivor Advocacy for TAPS, and Mr. John Tolles, who is Deputy Director of the National Legislative Services for the Veterans of Foreign Wars. Thank you all for being here and for working and for the work you do with your organizations, and that you do it every day, and we know that and we appreciate it, that you work to improve the lives of our veterans, and we thank you for that. Mr. Zhang, we'll begin with you, and you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Distinguished members of the Subcommittee on Disability Assistance and Memorial Affairs, on behalf of the National Commander, Denise Rowan, and the members of the American Legion, the country's largest patriotic wartime service organization for veterans, comprised of over 2 million members and serving every man and woman who has worn the uniform for this country. We thank you for this opportunity to testify on behalf of the American Legion's position on the following. I am Alex Zhang, Assistant Director of Veterans Affairs and Rehabilitation Division. It is my duty and honor to present the American Legion's position on these important issues. H.R. 3122, the Veterans Care Financial Protection Act of 2017, is a step in a positive direction for veterans as it helps create protections to prevent or minimize financial scams directed at veterans who are surviving on a minimal salary. This bill also creates a national standard directed by the GAO to other federal agencies to follow the guidelines set in this law. Too many times, veterans are preyed upon by less than scrupulous organizations looking for a quick buck. These veterans are often in nursing homes or living paycheck to paycheck. We owe it to these men and women who protected this country by defending them from organizations that thrive on scams targeting veterans. The American Legion fully supports this legislation and any legislation that aims to stop scams targeting veterans. We applaud Congressman Cartwright for spearheading this initiative. The draft bill, Veterans Fair Debt Notice Act of 2017, spells out the steps a VA debt collector should follow when attempting to collect a debt a veteran has incurred. This is a necessary precaution as there are many veterans who are unable to fully grasp the magnitude of the correspondence sent to their home, or in many instances, never received a letter regarding collection of debt. The American recently assisted a homeless veteran who incurred a large debt after the VA removed her dependents from her benefits retroactively to 2005. Due to her homelessness, she was unable to receive VA's letter advising her of the debt. Because she was unaware of her options, such as a repayment plan, the VA began recovering of the debt by garnishing all of her VA compensation. This went on for about a year before we were able to intervene and assist. Mr. Chairman, it is stories like this that show the importance of this draft bill. We cannot treat debt collection by looking at veterans as ones and zeros on a line item. If a veteran owes the VA money, they should repay, but they should be treated with dignity and properly informed of the rights before collection starts. Many of these issues can be avoided if VA remembers that veterans are humans with real-life issues. They are not the enemy, nor should they be treated as such. The American Legion supports this draft bill as written. Shifting focus, I would like to quickly address H.R. 1900, which would authorize the name National Veterans Memorial and Museum. Similar to the American Legion, they also have 4 pillars, being honor, connect, inspire, and educate. These pillars, in the opinion of the American Legion, will represent the American veteran with profound respect by honoring them, connecting them to the civilian population, possibly inspire others to serve, and most importantly, educate the youth about what these fine men and women have done for America. When asked why Ohio, they simply respond, because we did it. Truth be told, they raised $75 million and are currently in the construction process of what looks to be a beautiful and thoughtful memorial. The American Legion full-heartedly supports H.R. 1900, and again, Chairman Bost, Ranking Member Esty, and distinguished members of the committee, on behalf of National Commander Denise H. Rowan and the American Legion, we truly appreciate this opportunity to speak with you this morning, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zhang. Mr. Acasio, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting the disabled American veterans to testify at this legislative hearing of the Subcommittee on Disability Assistance and Memorial Affairs. As you know, DAV is a nonprofit veteran service organization comprised of 1.3 million wartime service disabled veterans dedicated to a single purpose: empowering veterans to lead high-quality lives with respect and dignity. DAV is pleased to present our views on a bills under consideration by the subcommittee. We support with recommendations H.R. 3705, the Veterans Fair Debt Notice Act of 2017. This is consistent with the intent of DAV Resolution Number 213, which calls for alleviating undue financial hardship in processing overpayments and notifying veterans of debt. This draft bill, or H.R. 3705, proposes using certified mail to ensure VA notification letters concerning debt collection actions are received by debtors, and that plain language is used to explain the debt. Under current law, the date of notification is defined as the date of the VA letter notifying the claimant. However, this legislation mandates the use of certified mail, which requires the debtor to sign for the notification letter. This date of notification is key to launch the 30-day time period for the debtor to respond to the Secretary with a written dispute of the debt, a written request for waiver, and/or a written request for a hearing on the waiver. Accordingly, in our opinion, the date-signed receipt of certified mail by the debtor should be considered the date of notification and requires amendment in the regulation. In addition, this legislation should clarify if it actually intends for certified mail to be used by the debtor to respond to the Secretary. We believe this would place an undue burden and potential hardship upon the debtor, and we would oppose that specific requirement. We applaud the provision in the bill requiring a plain language explanation of why the debtor owes money. The overpayment and debt process can be confusing, complex, and overwhelming to many veterans who are often left guessing why the debt was created. We agree that a simple and plain explanation should be required in all debt notifications. As for H.R. 3122, the Veterans Care Financial Protection Act of 2017, DAV does not have a resolution specific to this issue, but we unfortunately continue to hear stories about various schemes to take advantage of elderly and disabled veterans who receive VA benefits. This measure seeks to address this issue and is beneficial. Therefore, we are not opposed to passage of this legislation. Concerning H.R. 1900, the National Veterans Memorial and Museum Act, which would designate the Veterans Memorial and Museum in Columbus, Ohio, as the National Veterans Memorial and Museum. DAV does not have a resolution from our members concerning this issue, and we have no position. Finally, DAV does not have a resolution specific to H.R. 1721, H.R. 3656, and H.R. 3657, and we are not opposed to their passage. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my testimony, and I would be happy to respond to any questions that you or members of the subcommittee may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Custer. And now we would like to recognize General Oatner for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Esty, Paralyzed Veterans of America would like to thank you for the opportunity to provide our views on pending legislation before the subcommittee. For H.R. 1721, the designation of American World War II cities would recognize specific cities not just for their great contributions on the home front during World War II, but also their efforts to preserve the city's structures and relics from that era. PVA supports this bill, which encourages cities to preserve this great heritage. For H.R. 1900, the National Veterans Memorial and Museum Act, PVA supports designating the Veterans Memorial and Museum in Columbus, Ohio, currently being constructed, as the National Veterans Memorial and Museum. It is the only museum of its kind, and it is intended to reach veterans of all eras, from every part of the United States, and from all branches of service. Given the scope of the project and its intended audience, a national designation is appropriate. PVA also supports H.R. 3122, the Veterans Care Financial Protection Act of 2017. This proposal would require the Secretary to work with federal and state officials to establish standards to protect against unscrupulous actors that take advantage of veterans in need of aid and attendance benefits. According to organizations such as AARP and the Federal Trade Commission, senior veterans have increasingly become subject to scams involving insurance agents and financial planners trying to convince the veterans to make quick decisions about pursuing aid and attendance in addition to their pension incomes. Some scammers use false representations like suggesting automatic entitlements to benefits. Of greater concern, though, are those who help the veteran restructure financial assets in order to qualify for pension and/or aid and attendance. For example, moving financial assets into a pooled asset irrevocable trust might render a veteran eligible for pension and aid and attendance despite having assets in excess of the qualifying income thresholds. While it appears this benefits the veteran, what these salesmen do not tell them is that this type of restructuring might preclude them from Medicaid eligibility because of rules such as the 5-year look-back period, which considers whether one has moved substantial assets at less than market value. These financial products are specifically managed by alleged veterans advocates who are offering to help veterans secure enhanced benefits from VA. This is an objective conflict of interest, and implementing standards to protect against this behavior is necessary. PVA supports H.R. 3656, which would establish a consistent eligibility date for provision of memorial headstones and markers for eligible non-veteran individuals. Currently, spouses and children have different eligibility dates, sometimes forcing VA to provide a marker for the parent but not the children. This bill would reconcile this arbitrary difference and treat spouses and children the same. Likewise, PVA supports H.R. 3657 to authorize provision of headstones and markers in tribal cemeteries. Consistent with our prior support for H.R. 1390, which would expand VA's authority to transport the remains of a deceased veteran to a tribal cemetery or state cemetery instead of a national cemetery, we likewise support this bill, which ensures that the accompanying benefits, such as a headstone or marker, are provided to veterans buried in tribal cemeteries. Finally, the draft bill, Veterans Fair Debt Notice Act of 2017. PVA supports this legislation. Failure to resolve debt issues in a timely manner can have a lasting, catastrophic impact on a veteran. It is not uncommon for a veteran to find that the Veterans Health Administration has updated contact information while the Veterans Benefits Administration has not, or vice versa. So, as VBA sends out notice of overpayment of benefits or some other circumstances producing a debt owed by the veteran, it is essential that VBA know whether that notice actually reached the veteran prior to the veteran going into default. It is important to ensure that veterans are not going into default for lack of notice, especially in circumstances where the debt itself is a product of VA's mistakes and overpayments. Mr. Chairman, Ms. Esty, we appreciate your commitment to ensuring that veterans receive the best benefits and care available. We look forward to working with the subcommittee and would be happy to answer any questions you or the members may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Ms. Moltner, you may begin testimony for TAPS at this time.
Thank you very much, Chairman Bost, Ranking Member Esty, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. The Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, TAPS, thanks you for the opportunity to make you aware of issues and concerns of importance to the families we serve, the families of the fallen. While the mission of TAPS is to offer comfort and support for surviving families, we are also committed to improving support provided by the federal government, state governments, and local communities for the families of the fallen, those who fall in combat, those who fall from invisible wounds, and those who die from illness or disease. We thank the Veterans Affairs Committee for the recent improvements to survivor education benefits in the Harry W. Culmary Veterans Educational Assistance Act of 2017 and other recent legislation. We will be working closely with the VA on the law's implementation. TAPS is pleased to work with the VA within the framework of a memorandum of agreement signed by VA Secretary Shulkin and TAPS President and founder Bonnie Carroll in April of this year. The services provided by TAPS and VA are complementary, and in this public-private partnership, each will continue to provide extraordinary services through closer collaboration. Imagine you are a surviving spouse or dependent who opens a letter from the VA that notifies you that you suddenly owe the VA several $1,000s and they would like the payment in a lump sum as soon as possible. The only explanation is that there has been a change in benefits and you have been overpaid. While they provide an 800 number for you to call, every time you call, the number is busy. Before you know it, a third letter has been sent, still without a definitive explanation of what the cause of the debt is, and containing an ominous warning that you are subject to having your wages garnished, VA benefits withheld, and that your debt has been sent to a collection agency. This has really happened in one of the stories that we outlined in our written testimony. It can often be confusing for survivors tracking which payment comes from which agency. Many are often still in a fog of grief, and mail can lie unopened. Letters can be daunting as one sifts through legalese and unfamiliar terms. It can be even more confusing in dealing with education benefits, when funds are also impacted by the institutions of higher learning, their particular rules, and very often sharing of misinformation. Indicative of the specialized support that TAPS provides is our education services portal and individualized support on the education benefits available for the children and spouses of America's fallen heroes. Through its MOA with the VA, TAPS has been able to often troubleshoot problems for families that reach out to us. We have helped several families resolve their issues with debt collection. TAPS was fortunate to receive a briefing from the VA Debt Management Center at the July 2017 meeting of the DoD VA Survivors Forum. The briefing clearly outlined the processes and procedures that the DMC uses to notify beneficiaries and to collect the debt owed. The procedures as outlined in the DMC brief appear to be designed to make the process easier for the customer, the survivor or veteran. The stumbling block, as we have heard from many today, is making it easier to connect the survivor or veteran with the assistance that DMC provides. We support the various means of contacting survivors and veterans that the VA had proposed earlier today. Clarification of the reason for the debt in easy-to-understand language, as called for in the proposed legislation, would go a long way in improving communication and access. Reinforcing the importance and urgency of the debt letter received from the VA by sending it certified mail will also help to ensure that the beneficiary responds in a timely manner. We are grateful that H.R. 3705 addresses these two important steps in the process. TAPS supports H.R. 3657 and H.R. 3656. We also support H.R. 3122, which calls for additional financial protections for those survivors in receipt of aid and attendance. They are among our most vulnerable populations for fraud and financial abuse. TAPS thanks the subcommittee for being at the forefront in protecting survivors and for crafting benefits that recognize their sacrifice. Thank you for allowing us to speak on behalf of the survivors we serve. I look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Moaker. And last but definitely not least, Mr. Tolles, you're recognized for 5 minutes to present the testimony of the VFW.
Thank you. Chairman Bost, Ranking Member Esty, members of the subcommittee, on behalf of the men and women of the Veterans of Foreign Wars of the United States and its auxiliary, thank you for the opportunity to provide our remarks on the following legislation pending before the subcommittee. With regards to H.R. 1721, the VFW supports this legislation, which would direct the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to designate at least one city in the United States each year as an American World War II city, which would be based on the city's contributions to the war effort and their continued efforts to preserve the history of such contributions. Throughout the past few years, multiple attempts have been made to pass similar legislation that would give the Secretary this authority, and while most of these attempts have passed the House, all have failed in the Senate. In general, the VFW supports legislation that seeks to recognize veterans and preserves the military history of our greatest generation. With regards to H.R. 1900, the VFW supports this legislation, which would designate the Veterans Memorial and Museum, which is currently being constructed in Columbus, Ohio, as a National Veterans Memorial and Museum. Continuing the legacy left by the late Senator John Glenn, the museum would serve as a civic landmark to honor, connect, inspire, and educate visitors about the sacrifice and service of all of our nation's servicemen and women. The creation of this institution would have a profound, lasting impact on every American and would help instill a deeper meaning in the freedoms we all enjoy. And while there are several museums and monuments dedicated to specific branches and eras, our country currently lacks a museum specifically dedicated to honoring and preserving the collective sacrifices made by all of these nation's veterans. We feel as though this museum would serve to fill this gap. This institution would serve as a constant reminder to all those the importance and value of military service by honoring the contributions of our veterans, educating the public about what it means to serve, and ensuring that our veterans, regardless of the location, branch, or era, have a nationally designated facility to call their own. In regards to H.R. 3122, the Veterans Care Financial Protection Act, the VFW strongly supports this legislation, which would address and correct many of the oversight and accountability problems which have plagued the Aid and Attendance Program for quite some time by directing the Department of Veterans Affairs to work with other federal agencies to develop standards that will protect veterans receiving ANA benefits from dishonest and predatory business practices. As the number of elderly veterans increases, so too does the need to provide them with additional assistance that enables them to the ability to complete day-to-day activities, but these services can be extremely expensive. Many veterans depend on the ANA program because it enables them to obtain these services. However, because of poor oversight, many veterans are being taken advantage of by individuals claiming to be consultants, and in some circumstances, even retirement homes. Sadly, predatory practices that target veterans, service members, and their families is nothing new. Last year alone, the CFPB received over 11,000 complaints from veterans regarding VA loan financing companies who were engaging in aggressive solicitations and misleading advertisements. An additional 2,700 complaints concerning businesses engaged in consumer loans for veterans and service members. Not only do these practices cost the federal government millions in taxpayer dollars, but oftentimes results in the veterans being responsible for repaying any debt incurred, which makes an unstable financial situation even worse. It is unfortunate that legislation such as this even needs to exist. However, so long as the need is there, the VFW will support any measure meant to protect the financial well-being of our nation's veterans. With regards to H.R. 3656 and 3657, the VFW supports both pieces of this legislation. H.R. 3656 would codify the date of eligibility for VA-provided headstones and markers for the spouse and any dependent children of a veteran whose remains are unavailable on or after November 11, 1998, and 3657, which would expand the headstone and marker eligibility for spouses and dependent children buried in tribal cemeteries. And finally, with regards to the draft bill, the VFW strongly supports this legislation. During the O&I hearing yesterday, Ms. Lori Rectanis testified that, quote, because the VA lacks key elements of an effective mail management program, the VA cannot provide assurance that facilities are managing their mail efficiently. Every year, the VFW assists thousands of our members who have received overpayment notifications from the VA, many of which are erroneous. Almost every single letter is the same. It uses ambiguous language, gives no clear options to request recourse, and directs the veteran to contact the VA with any further questions. As you can imagine, this leaves many fearful of the process as a whole, given how unresponsive the VA has been in the past. To be blunt, our veterans deserve more. To add an additional layer of complexity, many times the contact information is incorrect, as my colleagues have also testified to. Ultimately, if the veteran fails to respond to the debt notice, it can result in their pensions being garnished until the debt's satisfied or the debt going to a collections agency. This is unsatisfactory. By requiring debt notification to be made in easy-to-understand language via certified mail, veterans will be able to understand what they need to do in order to ensure the issue is addressed in a timely manner. With that, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Esty, this concludes my testimony. The Veterans of Foreign Wars sincerely appreciates the opportunity to provide views on these important bills, and I'm prepared to take any questions you or other members of the subcommittee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Toles. And I will start with yielding myself 5 minutes for questions. Mr. Costa, can you explain why the DA believes that the H.R. 3705, the Veterans Fair Debt Notice Act, needs more clarification? Can you expand on where your testimony was there?
The portion where it says for the debtor to respond to the VA, that's what I'm talking about. And it's clear when you read it a couple of times, it appears that it's requiring the debtor to respond by certified mail.
Yeah, and I don't think it's the intent of this. We don't think it's the intent of the sponsor, but we will make sure that we talk with them specifically on that. Ms. Moakler, your written testimony supports expanding the eligibility for gravestones and markers to spouses and dependents who are buried in tribal cemeteries. Can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit?
That tribal cemetery, the folks who are eligible for tribal cemeteries are as deserving of headstones and markers as those who are buried in state cemeteries, because I believe they have a similar standing. So,
right. Mr. Toles, can you explain why the VFW supports H.R. 3656 regarding memorial headstones and markers?
A lot of the issues revolve around people, as the sponsor mentioned, that go missing at sea due to a boating or plane accident. It just, in our opinion, it provides parity between the two areas or the two populations reflected in the bill. It makes a situation right instead of having to rely on exceptions to policy.
General Ortner, can you explain why PVA's concerns about the salesman who promised to restructure veterans' finances assets in order to qualify for pensions or aid and attendance? Kind of expand on where you believe.
Well, I think, Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. I think it's pretty obvious in the current country of the preying on older Americans. And unfortunately, in a case where the VA processes are relatively complicated, and the reason they hire VSOs to try and work them through the system can make them, I think, more susceptible to someone that comes in and says, oh, let me fix this for you. I think there really needs to be some aspect of legislation or regulation that puts a higher bar in there for anybody that's going to try and do something like that, just like we need for other Americans in this country.
Okay, my next question is for everybody here because I really want to the concern I had with H.R. 3122. Did anybody on this panel, would you disagree if all of a sudden we found a different agency that could possibly do it better in our government to make sure we provide these protections? Because we're kind of questioning whether or not the VA can do it, or whether whose scope it's under. And you're really concerned, and that's what I'm wanting to each of you to answer. You're really concerned about just making sure that the veteran is protected and not subject to the possibility of these fraud, so we're trying to look for the right agency. Does it matter which agency does it?
I would have to say, Chairman, I would have to say it's not germane, because VA was created for the purpose of helping veterans, so it should stay with VA.
Mr. Chairman, I'd have to say if the intent is to help ill and injured veterans, then it should stay with the VA.
I think the end result is what is key here. But obviously, I think we could support going with another agency. However, I think what would probably be more critical is seeing exactly what that agency is, why that agency is going to be able to do it better than someone else. I think I'm not big on passing the buck. I think that if it's the VA's job, the VA should just learn to do the job right.
I don't have much experience with this issue as far as coordination of effort, but if we look at the exploitation of veterans' education benefits, if we work with the organizations that have that expertise, be it the FTC, be it the Department of Justice, and people work in coordination, then we'll be able to get the best outcome for the veteran or survivor using these benefits.
Mr. Chairman, from what we've seen at the VFW, there exists within the CFPB an Office of Service Member Affairs, which deals with a lot. I mean, they specifically handle complaints and issues coming from the veterans and military community. With regards to how that they might be able to add some expertise or some assistance to what's going on with the current ANA issue, I can't speak to that personally. But I would say that there is probably existing architecture within that agency to help augment and help sort of provide some additional oversight to these issues.
Thank you. And my time's expired, so I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Esty. 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for being with us here today. To just quickly follow up on this last point, which I too had some questions about, I think it's noteworthy that Senator Warren is the co-sponsor and lead sponsor in the Senate, so presumably is one who helped create that agency. She does not believe that that is sufficiently able to do its job, so I think that is instructive for us to consider. But I do think it is worth a question for all of you. Do you think it would be helpful for the VA to take a proactive role if somebody is beginning to receive ANA, to send out a notice? And frankly, I think we're very concerned about the asset issue, whether notice should go to family members, because we know this to be a chronic pattern of taking advantage of the elderly, and this is yet another venue specifically targeted at veterans.
Absolutely. I think that education is the best form of prevention.
I believe that that would be very worthwhile, because in many cases the VA is already communicating with family members, especially where a family member has fiduciary responsibility. But an overall campaign of this through maybe AARP or some other outside organizations, feature on a morning TV show or something like that, would create a better awareness, because you can't always identify who the family member is that's supporting the veteran or survivor.
Yeah, I tend to agree that I think getting the message out, getting the education out is probably the most critical thing, especially if you go through the families. But it probably needs more than just education. There needs to be some penalties and direct action against any unscrupulous people that would take advantage of a veteran like that.
We'd certainly be willing to take a look at any legislation that will be proposed to enable veterans to obtain all the benefits available to them, especially ill and injured veterans.
We would have to look at, we can concur with it, but here's the problem. It would have to be revolutionary in that you'd have to train, retrain, and readjust. Also, there's a byproduct of that. Not all veterans have a stable home situation, so you'd have to look at homeless and how you deal with that. So that's the byproduct on that.
Thank you very much. Wanting to turn down to the proposal to designate as national the museum that is underway right now in Ohio. I think we're all very supportive of having a memorial, a national memorial. I do have a question. It's currently being marketed as national. Is that concerning to any of you that it's being marketed as a national museum and memorial, which has not received that designation from this body? And as stewards of the taxpayers' expense, I have some concern about that. I don't know if any of you have concerns. I have a couple questions. That's one. One is, unlike the national museums that we have here in Washington, which are free to all who come, the proposal here is to charge everyone who attends. Is that of something, did you look at that? Did you consider that in terms of your support? Because these are among the kinds of questions we have to consider. And others, those that have not come through Congress but have come later, have typically been in operation for a number of years. And a question about endowments. These are some of the kinds of questions that we need to be considering and wondering your thoughts on any of these issues. You're on the front lines every day with our veterans. We're tremendously supportive of this concept, but trying to do it in a way that makes the most sense and is in keeping with Congress's responsibility, but also that openness when something receives a national designation.
It's not a problem, the word national, because where there are veterans, we're systemic. We're all over. You build it, we'll come.
I guess the question is on charging, which we don't say here. None of the museums charge. The Smithsonian doesn't charge. But this is the plan is to charge anyone who attends.
I understand it, but I don't think it would be an issue for veterans and others that are interested, because again, they raised $75 million on their own. So if they can do that, it may be down the road, there may be some issues trying to get the fiduciaries together to support it. But if it becomes really national and the bill passes, then I don't think it should be an issue.
Yeah, PVA, we actually discussed that a little bit. We're not concerned about that, primarily because the fact that it's national and the idea that they had created a large amount of funds to create the facility themselves, its location, as was, I discussed earlier, the fact that it is within short range of a lot of veterans. We don't see that as an issue. I know another question came up: could this somehow lead, by calling it national, could that somehow lead to a requirement of federal funding for the facility? The fact that the legislation does not identify or require anything like that, I don't think that needs to be a concern. I suppose later on, if they wanted to come and make that argument, I suppose that's a possibility that could be denied at that time. But we don't really have a problem with it. As for charging, the difference between Washington, D.C. and virtually every other museum in the country is significant. The Smithsonian highlights the fact that their museums are all free, but they're also pretty much fully funded by the federal government as well. So I don't think there's a problem with that.
With regards to the funding, we were of the understanding that the intent, once the museum opens, is to offer admission to veterans and survivors at no cost. The other funds will be generated through folks who weren't veterans or military. So that sort of takes care of that. Additionally, as the others have said, they've done a really good job at sort of funding their way so far. So we have no qualms or worries or concerns about that. The location, to be quite honest, we've received complaints from veterans that coming to D.C. for going to the wall to have group photos taken, most notably the honor flight folks, getting, I'm not going to say harassed, that's a strong word, but being stopped by the Park Service folks and saying, do you have a permit to be here? Do you have a license to take these photos? If they're going to start charging for veterans to take photos at the wall, I mean, it's kind of it's unfortunate, right? So them going to Columbus to a museum that honors all veterans, it may be, that might be what we're seeing future, because people may not want to come here because they feel as though they're being harassed or having to pay for something that they feel should be theirs. And I think ultimately, the fact that it's not built yet, I think that it's gotten enough grassroots support, it has enough the key thinkers. A lot of the folks that were behind the World War I Commission are also giving their 2 cents on this. They're on the board, the steering committee right now. I think that it'll be fun in the end.
And if I may, Mr. Chairman, I think we would very much want to follow up with your comments about harassment or other questions being asked of people at the memorials. And Mr. Chairman, if we could follow up with you, and that may need to be something we have a hearing on, because that's completely inappropriate, should not be happening, and very distressing for us to hear that any of our veterans or family members are having that sort of experience. It's just not right, and we will.
And we should contact the Committee with Natural Resources too, because that's where, you know, they would be the overseers, and we would not want that to happen. If it is happening, we want to make sure that it's stopped.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And if we have further questions, we will. Oh, did you yield back? I'm sorry.
I yield back. I'm way over time at this point, but thank you.
Okay, if anyone has any further questions, we'll be contacting you, the staff will. Thank everyone for joining us today and sharing your views in the subcommittee. Your testimony provides us with important insight into these proposals as we move forward with this legislative process. And I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extended material on any of the bills under consideration this afternoon. Without objection, so ordered. This hearing is now adjourned.